Ask anyone in the know what the fastest gaming CPU is right now, and you'll get only one answer: Ryzen 7 9800 X3D. Ever since the launch of the previous gen 7800 X3D in 2023, AMD has maintained an unassailable lead in gaming, all thanks to that stacked 3D V-cache. AMD weren't the only ones to build a bespoke cache die to improve performance. In the 2010s, Intel did it too. This is a Core i7-5950HQ, one of the relatively few Intel CPUs to include a 128MB L4 cache die. Today, I tell the story of how these CPUs came to be, how they disappeared, and what this i7 can still do over a decade later. Our story starts in 2005 at Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference. It was there that CEO Steve Jobs, rest in peace, announced to the world that Apple would be abandoning IBM's PowerPC CPU architecture in favor of Intel's x86, a promise they quickly followed through on with the release of the 2006 Core Duo-based iMac and MacBook Pro that January. A month later, the Intel Mac Mini launched, becoming the first Apple computer to use Intel integrated graphics, namely GMA 950. The Mac Mini would be joined by the 13-inch vanilla MacBook and some 17-inch iMac models later in the year, using the same IGP. GMA 950 was extremely popular at the time, but that doesn't mean it was good. Simply put, it relied heavily on the CPU for even the most basic 3D rendering and video playback, but it was good enough for a while. The 13-inch MacBook was upgraded to GMA X3100 in November 2007, and the same IGP would appear in the new MacBook Air the following January. 2008 would prove to be a turning point for the Mac ecosystem, and not in the way Intel would have liked. On October 14th, Apple dropped a bomb. Their new unibody MacBooks and 2nd-gen MacBook Air would make the switch from Intel chipsets to NVIDIA's, with the Air and 13-inch MacBook using the integrated GeForce 9400M alone, and the Pro including both 9400M and the discrete 9600M GT. By the end of Q1 2009, all Mac models that had previously relied on Intel GMA were supplanted by NVIDIA-powered ones, and by June, all GMA models had been discontinued. Apple talked up the outstanding 3D gameplay of the new GPUs, but there's a lot more to the Switch than that. An Intel chipset consisted of both a North Bridge and South Bridge in separate chips, whereas NVIDIA did it all in one chip. The GeForce had much better OpenGL support for accelerating the macOS GUI, an actually good video decoding block, and support for OpenCL for general-purpose GPU compute. The message was simple: Intel graphics weren't good enough anymore. GMA X4500 would make its way into exactly 0 Macs, but bringing the Northbridge on package for the Arendelle i5s and i7s was enough to land OG HD graphics a spot in the 2010 15 and 17-inch MacBook Pros, backed by a discrete GeForce. That year's smaller MacBooks and Mac Mini snubbed Arendelle entirely, and continued using GeForce integrated graphics even if it meant being stuck with last-gen Core 2 Duos, but this arrangement couldn't last. Intel and NVIDIA were caught up in a licensing dispute that ultimately resulted in NVIDIA leaving the chipset business entirely, forcing Apple to return to Intel integrated graphics. That wasn't such a bad thing, as Intel had been cooking up the long-awaited Sandy Bridge. These CPUs are legendary for good reason, but it's their IGP that really matters to this story. HD Graphics 3000 performed on par with or better than the outgoing GeForce 320M, it was truly integrated into the CPU like never before, and even debuted hardware video encoding for the first time in the form of QuickSync. It wasn't everything Apple wanted, as it still lacked OpenCL support, but it was a crucial step in the right direction. Apple adopted Sandy Bridge across their entire 2011 lineup, and by March of 2012, all Macs with integrated GeForces had been discontinued. Later that year, Ivy Bridge and its HD Graphics 4000 rolled out, with much improved performance and finally, real OpenCL support. It was still a far cry from even the lowest-end DGPU for that generation, the GeForce GT 640M found on the lower-end 21.5-inch iMacs, but Intel was clearly putting in the work to make their graphics usable. That effort would bear more fruit than ever in 2013 with the release of Haswell. Up to this point, Intel graphics were divided into two tiers. GT1 occupied the low end with unnumbered HD graphics as well as HD 2000 and 2500. GT2 was for full-size IGPs like HD 3000, 4000, and for Haswell HD 4200 through 4600. Most OEMs were content to refresh their lineups with Haswell GT1 or GT2, enjoy their decent performance uplifts over Ivy Bridge, and call it a day. Apple was not one of those OEMs. Haswell introduced an even higher graphics tier. GT3 was twice as big as GT2 was, and Apple ate it up. None of their Haswell machines even bothered to use GT2, not even the smallest MacBook Air. A big IGP wasn't the only trick Intel had up their sleeve. They knew GT3 would require more memory bandwidth to reach its true potential than the DDR3 of the time would allow, and so developed one of the coolest bits of silicon in their history. This little guy is Crystalwell. It's a 128MB slab of embedded DRAM, or eDRAM, manufactured on the same 22nm process as their low-power Bay Trail SoCs. Crystalwell, in its first incarnation, ran at 1.6 GHz on a bidirectional 256-bit bus, leading to 102.4 GB of bandwidth in total. That's 4 times the bandwidth of dual-channel DDR3 1600 alone. Crystalwell wasn't just for graphics either. Intel's engineers were smart enough to give the eDRAM controller its own stop on the ring bus and set it up as a true L4 cache so the CPU could benefit from it too. This did come with a drawback. A quarter of the 8MB of L3 cache was reserved for tags to keep track of the data being cached in eDRAM, but that was a small price to pay for the performance benefits an L4 cache brought. IGPs with Crystalwell on board were given a new tier, GT3E, and a new name, Iris Pro. Naturally, Apple was first in line to use GT3E, and the Iris Pro 5200 would be the graphics of choice for the base model late 2013 iMac and 15-inch MacBook Pro. The previous generation of both machines included discrete G-forces, so Intel legitimately killed off NVIDIA in some market segments. Intel would follow up Haswell with Broadwell, a generation that didn't go according to plan. Broadwell was supposed to be a 14nm shrink of Haswell that would slot into its usual lineup just like Ivy Bridge did before it, but their 14nm process suffered from poor yields, and Broadwell had to be delayed as a result. Intel refreshed their Haswell lineup in June of 2014 to hold them over until Broadwell was ready, giving us some overclocking gems like the Pentium G3258 and i7-4790K. It wouldn't be until that September that Broadwell would release, and even then only in the ultra-low power Core M series. The low-power Broadwell U wouldn't appear until January 2015, and the big kahuna Broadwell-h finally landed a year late in June. Like Haswell-H before it, Broadwell-h was available with Crystalwell, but its new and improved Iris Pro 6200 was too late to ship in the 2015 MacBook Pro 15-inch, though it did make it into some late 2015 iMacs. Unlike Haswell-H, Broadwell-H was made available on a desktop socket in the form of the i5-5675C and i7-5775C. These would be the first and last socketed x86 CPUs with eDRAM. Now, I would love to talk about the 5775C, but I don't have one. I do have the next best thing though. This is the i7-5950HQ, sort of. This is one of those Chinese frankenchips where some intrepid lads in Shenzhen made an LGA interposer and soldered a legitimate BGA qualification sample onto it so you can use it in a desktop. You can barely see it anymore, but the IHS is supposed to have i7-5950HQ-QS written on it in Sharpie. This chip and the motherboard I tested it in were loaned to me by a friend who asked to stay anonymous. He bought the 5950HQ from Taobao in the summer of 2024 for 348 Chinese yuan, or roughly $50 US. Quite a bit less than you can get a 5775C for today. Intel's list price for the 5950HQ was an eye-watering $623, so it only ever officially made its way into very expensive MSI gaming laptops. That price is ridiculous when you consider the 5775C's list price was $366, and they're very similarly spec'd chips. Both are quad-core 8-thread parts with 6 megs of directly usable L3 cache, plus the on-package 128MB of eDRAM, but the 5950HQ can clock 100 MHz higher most of the time. Both run the eDRAM at 1.8 GHz instead of 1.6 like Haswell-H did, for 57.6 GB per second of bandwidth in each direction. Officially, the 5775C tops out at DDR3 1600, but the 5950HQ bumps that up to 1866. The 5775C has a fully unlocked multiplier, while the 5950HQ is partially unlocked with 600 MHz of available turbo bins, though that won't be an issue today. The bigger problem is the compatibility issues this chip has with the Maximus 7 Heroes BIOS. I couldn't adjust the eDRAM multiplier because doing so would disable the eDRAM entirely. To get around this, I raised B clock as far as I could to 104.7 MHz, which took the eDRAM clock to about 1885 MHz. CPU voltage monitoring was broken too, so I had to disable it or I'd get beeped at on every boot. After that, I got the cores to 4.083 GHz at 1.31 volts, the cache to 3.77 GHz at 1.38 volts, and the RAM to DDR3 2303. I'm definitely thermally limited by this old Polymatech Mega Shadow, but the 5775C is known to top out around 4.2 to 4.3 GHz with ambient cooling, so I'm not missing out on much. With all that out of the way, how much faster does the eDRAM make the i7-5950HQ? Cinebench has never been a memory-bound benchmark, so the eDRAM does basically nothing here. Best case scenario, the i7 picks up a measly 3% with it enabled in 2024. Worst case, it drops the score a hair in the single-threaded R23 test. Geekbench shows a wider range of gains, from not even 2% in several versions to a decent enough 14% in Geekbench AI. X265 encoding doesn't care much for eDRAM either. We're seeing another 3% improvement regardless of the output resolution. 3D Mark 11 physics was one of the best showings for the L4 cache, though I can't say the same for the rest of this chart. The single-thread CPU profile bench was the single worst result in the suite, though we're only talking a 0.5% regression here. I had to leave out PC Mark Vantage thanks to the Vista-era Windows Mail client's removal from post-2016 versions of Windows 10. More single-digit % gains here, but at least the slower platforms gain a little ground against the mighty i7 this time. The legacy math test continued the trend of eDRAM not doing much. I wish I had more to say. Y-Cruncher 25 million's dataset fits entirely in L4 cache, but even then, that's only enough to boost performance by 8%. The larger sizes gain less than half that, and the BBP tests are completely unaffected since they're designed not to touch RAM. The OpenCL-powered GPU Pi behaves the same way. The only difference between the tests is how much slower the other CPUs are. New to the suite is Intel XTU, which I have no prior data for, so it's just the i7 for this one. The original XTU bench is based on Prime 95 and really suffers without eDRAM, to the tune of nearly 20%. I can't say the same for the Linpack-based XTU 2.0, where the gap once again shrinks to less than 1%. So aside from some outliers, eDRAM doesn't do very much in my CPU benchmarks. There's just not enough raw horsepower from these 4 cores to run into a memory bottleneck most of the time. I haven't mentioned overclock scaling yet, so I'll show you that now. It's more or less 10% in all the multi-threaded benches, with single-thread tests and PC Mark falling a little short of that as expected. Just for fun, I ran the numbers against the A8, and to no one's surprise, the older quad gets slaughtered. Y-Cruncher is especially brutal. Bespoke executables for both architectures and no memory dependence make the i7 an order of magnitude faster in the BBP tests. Looking at the 5950HQ from a strictly CPU-focused perspective, it's no wonder Broadwell was the only generation with eDRAM to officially reach a desktop socket. Only a few benchmarks show any major performance improvements from adding the extra cache, and the year-old cheaper 4790K would have been as fast or faster without it much of the time. I'd be remiss not to mention the impact eDRAM has on gaming specifically, but seeing as Iceberg Tech already covered that very well in his video on the 5775C, I decided not to retread the same ground, and instead focused on the integrated graphics side of the 5950HQ. After all, graphics are the main reason Crystalwell was developed in the first place. Iris Pro 6200 set a new high watermark for the Intel IGP, with the equivalent of 384 shader cores, 24 TMUs, and 12 ROPs. These specs are pretty similar to those of the Radeon R7 250, a contemporary low-end GPU that retailed for $90. I still have this low-profile XFX model I bought used on eBay back in September 2015 for $53 shipped, so I overclocked it to match the 5950HQ's 1150 MHz core and 933 MHz memory clock speeds for a real test of its prowess. Speaking of overclocking, Iris 6200 isn't very good at it. After raising the B clock earlier to 104.7 MHz, I wasn't able to raise the multiplier beyond the stock value, so 1204 MHz at 1.235 volts is what I ended up at. On the feature set front, Iris is a mixed bag. On one hand, its Gen 8 architecture was the first with double-rate FP16 processing, something that wouldn't be seen anywhere else until the PS4 Pro in 2016. On the other, Intel's Windows drivers severely limit its API support. No major features were implemented after those introduced in Windows 10 15.11. That means no Shader Model 6.0, no WDDM 2.1, and no Vulkan. OpenGL support is capped to version 4.4, and even the DirectX 12 implementation is subpar. Feature level 11.1 is supported just like on 1st Gen GCN, but a critical feature is missing: Tier 2 resource binding. This was a sticking point for DX12 on Fermi, and it's a sticking point here too. If Iris is going to impress against the R7 250, it's going to need to use that eDRAM to its fullest. So, does it? Judging by the legacy Direct3D benchmarks, the answer is a resounding yes. Iris 6200 goes from losing almost every race against the R7 250 to completely dominating it. 3D Mark 06 is especially bad for the Radeon. Even without eDRAM, Iris comes out ahead by 14%. Like PC Mark earlier, 3D Mark Vantage didn't feel like cooperating, so it's CloudGate alone for this chart. It's not looking good for AMD. Intel's 16% lead grows to 46% when eDRAM is enabled. DirectX 11 is a much more competitive field, with the R7 besting even the overclocked Iris in 3D Mark 11 performance, and winning another 2 matchups versus Iris at stock. Catzilla is a completely different story. Iris is entirely unbothered by the Radeon at stock, and only loses by a whisker at 4K without Crystalwell's help. As the resolution drops, Intel pulls progressively further away from AMD, likely a result of the IGP's access to that super fast L3 cache. Unigen's benchmarks are a mixed bag. Superposition uses way more than 2GB of VRAM for these tests, so the R7 is penalized for VRAM swapping while Intel is unaffected. The Radeon beats Iris with eDRAM off in heaven, but the basic tests use a massive 47% improvement from turning it back on. VRMark is entirely irrelevant for this class of hardware, but it makes for some interesting results. As the tests ramp up in intensity, the eDRAM becomes less effective, and the R7 gains ground, becoming the fastest GPU in Blue Room. These tests are all calibrated for a target score of 5000, just to give you an idea of how far these GPUs are from being usable. I was honestly expecting worse from Intel and 3D Mark's DirectX 12 tests, but Iris does a reasonable job sans eDRAM, and consistently beats AMD with it. Like superposition, TimeSpy Extreme needs more than 2GB of VRAM, so the R7 250 sinks to the bottom. Last up is Geekbench Compute. Iris holds its own in Geekbench 4, but gets left in the dust in the newer versions. While I didn't test it, there's a good chance the R7 would do even better if I used Vulkan in Geekbench 5 and 6 instead, but I wanted to keep the comparison fair. All up, the eDRAM makes a substantial 21% difference to Iris's performance. To put that into perspective, the gap between the RTX 4060 Ti and 5060 Ti is smaller than that. In the clock for clock race, Iris did come out a few percent slower than the R7 250, but I'm still impressed with that. Intel has some solid wins here, and who knows how the results would shake up if their drivers were more polished. Add eDRAM, and Iris is now firmly 15% faster, more if it didn't fall on its face in OpenCL. Comparing Iris to the A8's IGP shows how much progress integrated graphics made in 4 years. Remember, both GPUs have the same amount of memory bandwidth, and Iris comes out nearly twice as fast. With Crystalwell in play, the difference is even more stark. The overclock scaling is great too, considering the GPU core clock only rose 4.7%. It goes to show that even with 128MB of cache to play with, there are still gains to be found with faster RAM. So, Iris is pretty good in synthetic graphics benchmarks, but does that translate to actual games? Let's find out, starting with a contemporary title, Assassin's Creed Rogue. This is the last game in the series to release on 7th gen consoles, and it's pretty easy to run. Iris at stock performs roughly the same as the Xbox 360, but with way better visuals, and it's a good distance ahead of the R7 250 too. eDRAM makes a massive 40-ish% difference in all 3 metrics. Civ 6 isn't nearly as friendly. The standard mid-game benchmark sees Intel falling behind AMD in all configurations, and eDRAM only adds 13% to the average frame rate and a little more to the lows. The situation only gets worse in the Gathering Storm bench. The R7 gets pretty close to a 30fps average, and Iris doesn't. I also ran the AI turn time benchmarks, and the Radeon is a little bit faster than Iris at stock here too, despite the CPU parity. The Gathering Storm AI test is much the same. LEGO Incredibles is far from the best LEGO game you could play on this setup, but it is the most recent. This is the best showing yet for Crystalwell, with the 0.1% lows improving by more than 50%. The R7 isn't doing too great here, but keep in mind this Syndrome boss fight is much more demanding than the vast majority of the rest of the game. I 100% of this game exclusively on Iris, so I can vouch for its performance. Red Faction Guerrilla is the first game to cause real problems for Intel's drivers. I would normally test with texture resolution at high, but on Iris that causes the game to crash before you can even finish loading a save. With low textures, the game runs well even without eDRAM, though the R7 delivers the best frame time consistency of the bunch. There's another problem though. On Iris, damaged vehicles will exhibit flickering textures and erratic switching between damaged and undamaged geometry, something I've never seen happen before. Out of curiosity, I tested the Radeon again with high texture quality and performance was more or less unchanged. World War Z is unplayable for Intel with all this geometry corruption, and that's a shame because performance is reasonable, if a little stuttery across the board. This is another title that benefits from eDRAM just as much as LEGO Incredibles does, so I guess that counts for something? As you'd expect, the R7 has no rendering problems in this game. I originally wanted to test F1 2020 at the low preset, until I ran it once and all the textures disappeared. It turns out this is caused by the rain effect, and you can sidestep the problem by disabling particles. I decided to use the ultra low preset instead, and that let all configs average 30 FPS, but with poor lows on eDRAM-less Iris. The Radeon is once again the fastest GPU on the board, and it renders particles no problem. Halo 4's PC port is another disappointment, but not for any driver-related reasons. The game stutters every time this loading message appears, and it's a serious distraction when the game runs at 60+ FPS otherwise. I admit, this test scene is likely a worst-case scenario, but there's clear potential here being squandered by poor asset streaming. Yakuza 5 has inexplicable performance problems of its own. The frame time consistency falls apart as you can see in the RTSS overlay, but only on overclocked Iris. This isn't a game that likes to run without a framerate cap, and luckily Iris can maintain 30 FPS just fine as long as it has eDRAM behind it. There is some minor artifacting on clothing as you can see here in the splash screen, but it wasn't super distracting outside of certain cutscenes. It's no surprise by now that the Radeon is unaffected. If you thought what you've seen before was bad, wait until you see CS2. Almost every benchmark pass on Iris froze for multiple seconds around this same spot, for seemingly no reason. There's good scaling here between the different configs, but it hardly matters when the only remotely playable GPU is the R7 I saved BeamNG for last since it's still in early access, and I was pleasantly surprised by how decently it runs with eDRAM enabled. The Radeon didn't do so great here, thanks to its harsher framerate drops in some parts of the map. I ran these tests before the 0.37 patch dropped, so the results could potentially be even better than what you see here. To say I'm disappointed in the Iris 6200 gaming experience would be an understatement. It pains me that there's so much potential in the hardware that so often goes unrealized because the craptastic Intel drivers keep getting in the way. Intel graphics had a bad reputation for decades because of issues like these, and you can't even write off the GPU itself like you could in the GMA era. I'm genuinely considering revisiting this IGP in Linux, because I refuse to believe that these problems can't be solved. In any case, there's no denying eDRAM's effectiveness for gaming. It allows for higher settings that just wouldn't be playable otherwise, and as an integrated graphics enjoyer, I love it. There's one more aspect of the 5950HQ I want to cover, and that's QuickSync. Intel's video block has been a selling point of their IGP since its debut in 2011 with Sandy Bridge, and I want to see if it lives up to the hype. Broadwell contains 4th generation QuickSync. On the decoding side, that means full acceleration for these 5 codecs, and hybrid acceleration for H.265 and VP9. These 4 codecs are mostly irrelevant today, so I'll just be focusing on these 3. I don't have much to say about H.264, because Iris handles it flawlessly. 8-bit 4K 60 is no challenge at all for it, so let's move on to H.265. Intel added hybrid H.265 decoding to Broadwell in January of 2015 with a driver update, with both 8-bit and 10-bit color supported. Sadly, its usefulness is limited. There's only enough horsepower on tap for 8-bit 1440p or 10-bit 1080p at 30 FPS, and perfect 60 FPS playback requires dropping all the way down to 720p. Disabling eDRAM makes the test Iris fail harder, but it doesn't have a serious impact otherwise. By disabling GPU decoding, performance improves dramatically, so let's condense the graph. The i7 is powerful enough to play all resolutions except for 4K at 60 FPS. Losing eDRAM makes a big difference in the worst case, but the overall conclusion is the same. H.265 GPU decode is just not worth it when the CPU is this fast. VP9 decode always fell back to the CPU, even though it appears as a support codec in DXVA checker. For what it's worth, Chrome has workarounds explicitly disabling hardware VP9 decode on Broadwell, so it seems we're not missing much. I tested CPU decoding anyway, and found that VP9 is overall a less intensive codec than H.265. For the first time, the overclock allows the 5950HQ to pass a test it fails without it, that being 8-bit 4K 60. On the encoding side, Broadwell supports 3 codecs, but I'm only going to worry about H.264. At 1080p, quick sync encoding falls somewhere between X264's ultra-fast and super-fast presets, for both encoding speed and efficiency. The speed and balance presets essentially act the same, and the quality preset seems broken. It produces the biggest file on the chart at the slowest speed, so I'd recommend avoiding it and sticking with the speed preset. At 4K, QSV catches up with X264 ultra-fast for speed, while producing a much smaller, higher quality file. Ultrafast is limited to H.264's least advanced profile, constrained baseline, so the compression artifacts are noticeable and distracting. In short, QSV is the fastest way to encode H.264 with acceptable image quality, and it's not hard to imagine Broadwell as an excellent HTPC or media server CPU back in 2015. Earlier, I said that Broadwell was the first and last socketed X86 CPU with eDRAM, and after all this testing, I see why. Yes, it makes the IGP substantially faster, but Intel is a CPU company first and foremost. The CPU performance improvements from adding Crystalwell are too situational to justify the higher manufacturing costs, higher customer pricing, and lower clock speeds. Broadwell-h's delay was so long that its successor, Skylake, launched just 2 months later, and Intel was more concerned with pushing the industry toward DDR4, a new socket, and a new chipset family, than pushing it toward faster IGPs. Thankfully, Crystalwell lived on after Broadwell. Starting with Skylake, Intel moved the eDRAM controller off the ring bus and onto the system agent, where it served as a cache for system RAM. This had the benefit of freeing up the 2 megs of L3 cache previously reserved for tags, but it also became invisible to the OS. The change was likely made to support the even greater bandwidth demands of Skylake H's massive GT4E IGP, the Iris Pro 580. It was 50% bigger than Iris Pro 6200 before it, and would be the most powerful Intel integrated graphics until Tiger Lake's 96EU Iris Xe G7 surpassed it in 2020. Apple's thirst for graphics horsepower was sufficiently sated by GT3E though, and Iris Pro 580 would never ship in a Mac. The most notoriety it ever got was from the Skull Canyon NUC. A cool machine to be sure, but not one that justified the investment. Apple would continue to deploy Crystalwell in machines like the 1080p 2017 iMac and 13-inch 2016 MacBook Pro. From then on, eDRAM would only appear in the 13-inch MacBook Pro, with the 2017 model switching to Kaby Lake U with 64 MB, and the 2018, 2019, and some 2020 models using Coffee Lake U with 128 MB. 2020 marked the death of Crystalwell. Later that year, Apple switched to their own silicon, and by then Intel was already shipping their 2 generations newer Tiger Lake chips. Ultimately, the 13-inch MacBook Pro is the perfect computer for Crystalwell. It's too small to put a discrete GPU in, but big enough that adding eDRAM won't throw the power budget out of whack. It's a shame we never got to see any further iteration on eDRAM itself. Crystalwell reminds me a lot of the AIM, in that it's a fascinating footnote in computing history that never quite lived up to its full potential, though Crystalwell certainly got a lot closer than the AIM did. If there were ever a time for Intel to bring back the bespoke cache die, it's now. AMD is killing it in the DIY market, and 3D V-Cache is no small part of that success. Earlier this year, rumors spread that Intel is planning to add so-called big last-level cache to some of their upcoming Nova Lake CPUs, and I hope they do. Competition is good. If nothing else, it'd make the CPU space exciting again. I want to thank my anonymous friend again for letting me dive into this rabbit hole, my patrons and members for supporting the show, and you for making it to the end of this long-ass video. The next one will be shorter, I promise.